We're here at Sugarhouse Studios to interview Anthony Engi Meacock of the architecture collective Assemble, who recently won the Turner Prize. Anthony, the Turner Prize win, obviously you guys weren't necessarily expecting to win it, but all of the coverage around it was very much focusing on your collaborative and participatory processes, which weren't new. I mean, that's the way you've always worked, even if the media kind of seized on it as something very zeitgeisty. Do you want to just elaborate a bit on how you started up?
I think what's probably potentially different about the way we work is because we started without a clear intention to be a firm, and we started by, I guess, through a common desire to build and do a project. We'd just recently graduated, most of us, although a few people come on from other places, and out of I guess a sort of slight disenfranchisement with the architecture profession working as a part one, and feeling that it was a kind of, especially in sort of the height of the recession in 2009, that there must be a sort of more fulfilling way of doing things. And so it started with a very kind of simple ambition to build a project, and that project eventually evolved to become the Cineroleum. But I guess it wasn't intended to be an office, so it didn't have a manifesto and agenda, and through that project we had to negotiate how to work with one another. And that's kind of the process that's led to the office. And so the office has kind of evolved out of a way of working that was about delivering projects, not about a kind of ideology or a kind of manifesto, and then it's kind of kept evolving, and it's still evolving now. And I think that's kind of this thing that's evolved quite naturally about just how you deal with other people. And that's sort of it, really. That's like kind of, there's no trick to it in the end, there's like a lot of discussion, and that's the kind of heart of it.
I think you said the Cineroleum project, basically the core team you have now kind of cohered around that project and has continued. Yeah,
basically you joined by the interview was putting up with working with us as a group, and if you could hack it and enjoyed it and kind of got something out of it, then you hung around, and people joined in that project and drifted off, but the core people have essentially remained unchanged since then.
That was more a case of you guys seeing an opportunity and wanting to create a cinema around a disused petrol station.
Yes.
The projects you took on after that were a lot more complex, I suppose, and having to negotiate with communities, with people who were briefing you. How did you develop that into something that you felt was truly participatory?
I guess it was, initially we were just quite naive about it, and the Cineroleum was done for the joy of it, and I think while, we just didn't think we had an audience beyond, we didn't have the sort of, there wasn't the intent, but also we just didn't think that people were that interested. And I think it was the reaction to that, and then the invitation to do the project after that, the Folly, that kind of showed that actually people took what we were doing quite seriously and were quite interested in it, and we started getting opportunities to do something more permanent. And they were temporary, not because we think temporary necessarily is the best way of doing things, but because that's the opportunity. Those are kind of the marginalia. You can get into doing something as a young architect or young designer, really, where obviously the risk of doing something permanent is so much higher. And so I guess it was just like then looking at how we enjoyed working, how we felt was quite successful, and how you can apply that to more permanent jobs. And the first job we did was New Angton, which was a public realm project for Croydon, and I guess that project was a massive learning curve. It was the first time really kind of implementing ways that were much more personal into a kind of setting that had clients and had other people with their own agenda.
What was the New Addington project?
It was a set of public realm improvements in the sort of main market square of New Addington, which is the sort of quite a poor suburb of Croydon. And we went in and kind of, again, like quite naively sort of tried to look at what activities already existed there and then tried to move them back out into the street. And I think the project was partly successful, but I guess where kind of it falls short of it is the reality that it's all well and good putting infrastructure in place, but actually the effort it requires to really change people's activity in the space requires a much bigger investment than just talking to them. And I think that really helped us evolve the way we worked at actually trying to do it for a much wider period of time. And something like Black Horse, things like that, they're much more about actually kind of we're still on the board, we're still part of it, and trying to maintain this kind of involvement that enables you to be part of the life of the whole thing. And that architecture starts far before the design starts. It starts with ideas, and it starts with funding, and it starts with the kind of local culture and the sort of the community, and that the activities already happen there, but it also ends for after the building opens, we think. And the idea that how something's inhabited and how people who use it really do feel ownership for something is vital, and without those kind of elements, and that's where even with the best intention actually their idea can sort of fail because of that life isn't taken into account.
Yeah, Black Horse was the first project where I suppose you felt there was a real legacy because it continues still. I mean, talk us a little bit through how the Black Horse project has evolved.
So Black Horse was...
it's in Walthamstow.
Yes, it's probably in Walthamstow that evolved out of, I guess it was a reaction to I mean, it sort of was slightly informed by what we did here, which is like learning from the way and sort of light industrial spaces and making spaces. It's not that accessible for most people to access sort of craft spaces. And there are other good workshops in London. You know, this is again like all these things. We're not the first to do this, but it felt that like in Walthamstow there's an opportunity as part of the Outer London Borough funding that happened after the riots. There was a sort of pot of money, and sort of we pitched this idea essentially of the idea of the library for tools. It was quite simple. And that over time there was a sort of, Walthamstow had this light industrial building they didn't really know what to do with at the time. It's sort of due for redevelopment at some point, but it provided this kind of suitable window of time for essentially testing the idea. And again, it's sort of a step above temporary, but sort of semi-temporary. They enabled like a test with not a huge amount of money spent in it to see if the idea worked. And that was like, yeah, again, it came up with a very simple concept, the idea of sort of a library for tools that was as open access as possible, and that enabled people to try and get involved in making and fixing and seeing that as a very valuable part of knowledge alongside kind of the more kind of traditional knowledge of book knowledge.
Yeah.
And that essentially, the core of that was really a business model rather than a building. And the building already existed, and there was light touches to make it. It's like almost like looking at what the touches are architecture to make something feel special, but actually the sort of lion's share of the work in that is really business model, setting up an organisation, employing the right people, and working with all the other people, and very much, I guess, you know, the architecture is very much the back seat, which are these sort of small touches that make it feel special, make it feel something different. But the fundamentals are about how the organisational structure works.
Tell me how, obviously these things fed into what you did at Granby 4 Streets. What did you start out thinking that project would be, and how did it evolve because of the people who were working alongside you?
So we were involved in Granby over a few years for various different things. We were brought in initially to look at this sort of larger development called on Ducey Street that's still sort of ticking over. And because of that, it was already in the area, starting to do some research and just sort of starting to get to know the area, and just through that we met quite serendipitously really the CLT at a kind of crucial point in them, when they'd you know, after years of this sort of degradation and sort of I mean the area is largely sort of split apart as a result of the managed decline, you know, the sort of Pathfinder scheme under Heseltine, a reaction to what they call the uprising, which mainly centred out of this area of Liverpool, L8, and sort of the few people who clung on and sort of eventually had like just turn the sort of moment where they turn away from sort of total desperation to being kind of allowed some scope and being potentially granted the houses, and so looking for an architect. And I think their general feeling of sort of professionals in general, professional classes, that they came in and told them how to live and how they were doing things wrong, and then when things went wrong just fucked off. And that's like a really like problematic situation where like it's neither kind of listening to what they want, what they feel, and how they live, and how and these aren't stupid people. And
they're very engaged, aren't they, by nature of being this community land trust. They had
and so it's the idea that so I guess we came in and just it seemed very obvious that we gelled very well in terms of the way we view things, and the fact that we listen, I think, was the main difference. And that actually, you know, what you do is you go and you listen for a long time, you spend the time trying to really understand the situation. And then it's not about, again, it's not this idea of imposing a solution that we already know. It's about very much what they thought of and working with them. And that was a very humbling experience coming into that, because these people who fought for 15, 20 years tirelessly for this thing and have kind of got it.
To be allowed to basically stay in houses that were perfectly habitable, that the council was trying to pull down.
And like it's like a sort of, it's a bit of chance for the people who are there own their houses because they managed to buy them earlier when they were very cheap, and whereas obviously all the council tenants got forced out. And so there's like, you know, it's a few moments of luck along the way, but they've really sort of fought tooth and nail, and sort of little kind of acts of taking ownership of things like painting the houses opposite them because they're tired of looking at empty houses, and planting. You know, it's the things like this. The landscape looks awful. What can we do to improve it? The houses will be empty. We can't change that yet, but what we can do is paint them so we're not looking at the houses that look like they're derelict. The street is sterile. Well, we can't completely change that either, but we can start planting it, start inhabiting it. And those little moves, I guess, facilitate them to, when in discussion with the council, for them to sort of grant them the sort of original 10 houses. And we just stepped in that moment where they were looking for an architect, had been tired of talking to people who essentially were more interested in just like applying what they thought was right rather than listening to them, and I guess we kind of fit quite well with them, and that's how things have moved forward.
Well, they had a lot of momentum already, didn't they? From things like starting at markets and the planting that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So they were already on board with.
Yeah, and this is like a situation where like 90%, 99% of the work is done by them, and we've come in and given that little bit of energy and expertise in the way that they don't have. But really, it's like, I think we feel very passionately and very powerfully that it's their. You know, they've done most of the work, and it's kind of the prize, if being given to Granby, is as much about their thing as it is about us.
And that was something that I think obviously struck a lot of people when they were reading about your work there through all the Turner coverage, the Turner Prize coverage. That sense of really working alongside the community, and also that wonderful kind of idea of repurposing whatever you could find that was of value there, or creating things of value out of stuff that had been neglected. That in a way was one of the sort of more provocative and artistic, I suppose, gestures.
I guess it's the idea that I think we're very quick to condemn things. We're very quick to condemn estates, and often problems, I think both problems are very much more complicated than that, and they do with sort of all sorts of causes, and it's rare that something is of total lack of value. And I also think that like what's happened in the area there is that sort of the tabula rasa developments have proved really problematic and haven't really worked. And so I think it's also a good case of timing where the sort of previous way of development has seen to be not that effective, and the council deserves some credit in recent years of seeing that and changing its opinion, where now we're not the only ones working in this area and about refurbishing in about sort of a much more piecemeal kind of careful way. And I think it's like the idea being then like the budget we had for each house there is very low. And so it's like, what are those small moves you can make with the sort of limited materials that change a sort of classic void, is how the sort of traditional kind of contractors call these houses, to something that feels like a home, and what are those kind of small moves you can make that don't break the budget but that give that element of specialness. And that's where the kind of the beginnings of the kind of objects that formed the workshop came from. This idea of these are the kind of slightly eccentric, potentially, things that change a kind of very, very standardly fitted out house with, thought, but everything is, the standards equipment. It's PVC windows because that's all they can afford. It's bog standard heating. It's, nothing's particularly special in itself, but it's how these little moments you start putting in that make something feel at home.
The concrete fireplaces, the bespoke concrete fireplaces that use lots of rubble, plaster and brick rubble, that somehow become quite beautiful when
it's like Granby rock, and that's, I guess, like a kind of slight phoenix idea of out of the rubble, and it's probably more allegorical than it is literal, but I guess it's a nice continuality, and the idea of like the hearth and the position of the fireplace in the home is very kind of psychologically important. So I think the fireplace was the kind of the first moment of that, and then that evolved into other objects.
There was a nice line that I heard one of your collective say at the Turner Prize exhibition, that it was about looking at these houses where everything of value had been stripped out and trying to create something that had some love and craft, and replacing the value with those things, even if they are made from rubble and concrete.
I think exactly, and the thing is, I mean, there's one of the CLT, this woman called Hazel, has written a really beautiful poem that sort of sums up their experience, and they refer to the idea of like the lead being stripped back in case the people who are there steal it. And there's kind of amazing hostility to residents there that was felt, I mean, particularly in the 80s and 90s. And again, I think it's that attitude has shifted slightly, but it's probably still there somewhere, in especially in some of the government now. But I think it's like idea of showing. It's it's the idea that if you patronise people, they won't look after stuff. They know when they're being kind of taken the piss out of, and I think it's people deserve more credit generally than they're given. And I think moments like that about saying like, look, we know this is cheap, a lot of it, but there are these things we can do that's special, and not trying to hide behind the fact that of like slick finishes to pretend that something's worth more than it is. About kind of honesty, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, and when did the idea come up that you could sort of leave a legacy there in terms of the social enterprise that now carries on making these things, the concrete fireplaces and the sawdust-fired ceramic light pools?
I guess that comes from, I guess it's a belief that that a city functions not just about residential accommodation, and I think a big problem with the pre-fringe development is that there's no consideration for any other life. And Granby Street previously was a really like vibrant high street in the area, and it was kind of quite important in the area, and that after riots was broken up as a sort of policy of trying to stop it being used for gangs, really, which again is like a great idea of somehow like architecture is the reason why gangs are there rather than social consequences and sort of backwards thinking. It's like you break the gangs and break the community, which sort of breaks the gangs at the same time, but doesn't really solve the fundamental problem.
It destroys the glue that holds the community together as well.
So you destroy everything, and that obviously gets rid of the gangs as well, but they move elsewhere, and then anyway, it's like naive social policy. But again, this idea of like actually, how can you start sort of commercial activity in the area again? And then I guess there's also an interest that we have in craft, and so it just was a few ideas that were sort of taking over that were sort of slightly on the agenda, but the Turner Prize nomination allowed, I guess, the platform to launch from.
And you used some of the money that was offered you for the creation of the work that was in the final exhibition.
Exactly, yeah.
To set that up. So there's lots in the whole scheme that I can imagine people being very inspired by. In the aftermath, I guess, of all that media attention, what have been the surprising and the unsurprising consequences in terms of people being interested in different aspects of what you do there or what you could do for them?
I think it feels like actually in some ways it's really too early to tell what the response is. I think potential benefit is that it shows that actually you can do a lot with not much, and that, you know, if it gives other people the confidence to go do stuff, that's really beneficial. And it feels that there is a slow kind of gradual change towards people, you know, thinking more holistically about development. I also think it's kind of, in the end, like fundamentally, it's like the economics behind everything is the real problem, and it's naive to think that somehow this is going to change that much. But I think if it inspires a few people to do different, that'd be great. But in the end, it's going to continue to be like a bit of a battle, and I think that's just the way it is. And I don't think we're going to change that, you know, that quickly.
But there is something that really captures the zeitgeist around participatory and collaborative working
I hope
in
so.
the way you approach your projects.
I hope so. I think it's difficult to say. I think if it, like I said, if it encourages people to sort of attempt things and work more openly, that would be really good. And it feels like it is part of a kind of growing belief in that also true collaboration, which I think we often refer to collaboration as a bit of a fudge word, and you know, people are very kind of, it happens too late and not in any real conviction, and you've already decided the decisions, and actually, you know, it's about deciding whether the door's blue or red, and that's not collaboration. And I think, you know, collaboration is almost like you have to give up control and give up authorship to the thing you're working with. And I think actually it's about, in some ways, getting it out of this idea that you're the author, that the author's much more vague. And if that can happen, that's great.
It was seen by many in the architecture profession as well. Certainly some of them thought it was a salutary lesson in not underestimating the people you're working with and allowing them more of a role. What did you feel was the reaction generally amongst your fellow architects, or even amongst the art?
You know, the sort of question of whether it is art or not, I find slightly reductive and sort of pointless, because it's something that's been going on since, well, like before Duchamp, and I don't think anything is ever answerable. I think what is interesting is looking how, like, what the role of creative practice is in cities in a wider context. And I think sort of outside the question of art or not, again, there's like, you know, people like Theaster Gates, which, you know, some of his stuff is really good, some of his stuff less so, and, you know, people like that really are about kind of bringing creative practice out of the kind of art bubble into a wider context. I think is a really interesting thing and a really interesting moment. I think in some ways that's what, I don't know, it's hard to say what the judges were doing, but it feels like that's what the kind of argument the judges were making was actually that creative practice deserves a much wider role in society than being kind of within the kind of very kind of closeted art world.
Absolutely. Did you get tired of being asked whether you consider yourselves artists?
No, I mean, it's not tired. It's just like, I don't understand why it's an interesting question. I actually just don't understand why it's like, it's one of the things that it feels like it's only of interest within the sort of art world that's very kind of closeted and kind of internally referential. But, you know, who is an artist? You know, sort of the Gombrich book starts with no such thing as art, only artists. I think that's quite an interesting comment. It's like, art is relative and what people see in value. And it's almost like art's a frame of critical reference you use to apply to things, and actually, and in that context, we've already got past the stage where anything can be art. So I think you can talk about the merits of the piece, and that's fine. But I find the question of whether art or not slightly reductive and slightly uninteresting. I mean, if people want to have that debate, that's fine. But I don't feel we need to enter into it that much.
I remember talking with you back in 2014 about the public art stuff that you were doing, and we were having this conversation about art. I loved your comment. I would always argue that architecture isn't art. When architecture gets itself into a hole, it's when it argues that it's about art rather than humans.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's not that art can't be about humans, but I guess the wearing the title of artist often removes you from the people you're working with. And I think we're very careful about what hats you wear often when we talk to people, because like equally wearing the hat of architect can be quite alienating. So, you know, if we stepped into Granby originally and be like, we're artists, I think it depends. Like, you know, it's like what's appropriate, and I think it's about being, in some ways, being far more fluid and far more dynamic, and sometimes it's appropriate to wear the hat of an artist, sometimes it's appropriate to wear the hat of an architect, sometimes it's appropriate to wear the hat of just a guy on the street, and it's about, I think, being about fluid and the product. I think what's really important is the product and what the merits of the product are. Yeah. And if the frame of reference you're looking for that is the one of art, that's great. If the frame you're looking at is one of the people using it, that's also great, but they're all kind of relevant. And I don't think it has to be either one or the other. I think things can exist across the spectrum, and that doesn't discredit like the value of art in itself either. It's just that things can be wider.
There have been a lot of people interested in working with you as a result of all this attention, I suppose.
Yeah.
Have you all had to sit down and have that conversation about how do we go forward as a practice with this extra kind of burden of being Turner Prize winning artists?
Yeah, I think it's something where we're due to have like a kind of big meeting where we sit down for a couple of days and really kind of go through stuff like that. I think, you know, in the sort of the negative part of it is that, you know, it's something that's quite nice being it's sort of slightly unknown and getting on with it, and sort of the level of scrutiny it gives you is quite difficult and quite intimidating at first. But I think it's a conversation we need to have and haven't sort of made time to have it, haven't had it yet quite yet. I also think it's also forms feel like it needs a couple of months to sort of settle in and realise to kind of see what actually it does change, or whether it actually is a kind of blip and then we kind of get back to doing what we do. It feels like slightly too early to say at the moment.
But do you feel that you can take the ethos that's obviously cohered in such a successful way forward, working on very different projects on a much bigger scale? Is there any
I think
sense
it's about the intent of the project that's the important thing, really. And I don't think it's not like a method or you know. I think that's the thing. It's like it's not a method. It's not a set of rules you can apply to anything. It's about being very loose with the process and really giving the process time to discuss it, which takes a lot of time. But I think there doesn't seem any fundamental reason why that couldn't be applied to other projects. But I always think we need to just try it, and it might fail, it might not. And you know, the whole process of Assemble so far has been this kind of evolution and discussion and kind of conversation. And I don't see any reason why that suddenly stops now. You know, it's like, okay, we've sorted that. That's you know, that's the sign we've finished that. And so I think it's about looking at each project and how that can be applied and what changes about it when you do something different. So yeah, I think it's exciting and interesting, but I don't see actually fundamentally why it changes the way we do things.
Yeah, so if a big developer came along and said, I want you know, to see what you could do with this mixed-use development, residential, retail, would you go, yeah, all right?
I guess it depends massively what the agenda of the developer is.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the question. Is like, what's the point of the project? The people behind it, the people who are funding it, all that thing. It's like, what's their intent? And if that's something that's positive and nice, then that's probably yeah. I mean, it's like we'd have to look at it very carefully, make sure that also we think that we can do a good enough job. You know, it gets to a scale where we potentially don't have the manpower. Then I think we also have to be we have our own kind of duty of care in a way to make sure that when we take something on, we can actually deliver it to the standard that we think that it's like it's called for it.
And it would also be presumably a question of how much control you had over what you did and what, you know, how it evolved.
Yeah, and it's like, and what's the intention of the project? Is it really to do something that is very high quality and very positive, or is it something more cynical? And
is it PR?
Yeah, and I think it's just about being and I think in some way that's the drawback of the Turner Prize, is that it also means that people now kind of can be used as PR, and it's about being cautious about that.